The steel deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi trembled beneath Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's polished boots as he gazed across the vast Pacific expanse on the morning of June 3, 1942. The rising sun painted the ocean in shades of crimson and gold, a fitting backdrop for what the Imperial Japanese Navy believed would be their most glorious victory yet. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the taste of triumph still lingered sweet on every sailor's tongue. Nagumo adjusted his white gloves and studied the formation spread before him like pieces on a master's chessboard. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through the waves with the grace of hunting sharks, their flight decks bristling with Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers. Behind them, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers formed a protective screen that seemed impenetrable. "Admiral," called Captain Taijiro Aoki, approaching with measured steps across the command bridge. "Weather conditions remain favorable. Our scouts report no American vessels within 200 miles of our position." The confidence in Aoki's voice reflected the mood throughout the combined fleet. Operation MI, the assault on Midway Atoll, represented more than just another strategic conquest. It was designed to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers and veteran pilots would crush their enemy once and for all. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the hero who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, stood near the chart table reviewing flight plans with his squadron leaders. His weathered face bore the calm expression of a man who had already tasted immortality. The pilots surrounding him, men like Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga and Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, represented the finest aviators in the world, forged in the crucible of China and tempered by 6 months of unbroken victory. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval history, The Two-Ocean War, the Japanese force approaching Midway represented the pinnacle of carrier aviation development, with veteran aircrews whose experience far exceeded their American counterparts. Below decks, Petty Officer Hiroshi Suzuki secured the last of the Aowai ordnance to a Kate's belly, the 500-pound bomb gleaming like a metallic egg of destruction. Around him, mechanics and armorers worked with practiced efficiency, their movements choreographed by months of repetition. The hangar deck hummed with activity as engines were tested and fuel lines checked one final time. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. While Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force approached from the southwest, Nagumo's carriers would launch a devastating airstrike against Midway's defenses. The American garrison, surely caught off guard by the speed of the Japanese advance, would be obliterated within hours. Then, when the inevitable American relief force arrived, they would sail into the jaws of the combined fleet and meet their doom. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu stood on his bridge wing, watching the formation maintain perfect station-keeping, despite the moderate swells. The sight filled him with pride. This was the force that had conquered half the Pacific, that had humiliated the British at Ceylon, and sent the American Asiatic fleet fleeing in disarray. Yet something nagged at the edges of Nagumo's consciousness as he watched the sun climb higher into the azure sky. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans might have more forces in the area than initially believed. Radio intercepts had been unusually quiet, and Admiral Yamamoto's own concerns about American code-breaking capabilities echoed in the back of his mind, but such doubt seemed almost treasonous when surrounded by such overwhelming strength. 4 carriers, 272 aircraft, and the finest naval aviators in the world. What could possibly stand against such might, thus? Distant outline of Midway Atoll shimmered on the horizon like a mirage, promising victory and glory. None aboard the Japanese fleet could imagine that they were sailing toward their own funeral pyre, or that the small speck of coral and sand ahead would become the graveyard of the Imperial Navy's dreams of Pacific dominance. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th began to give way to pale gray light as klaxons wailed across the Japanese fleet. On the Akagi's flight deck, the controlled chaos of launch operations unfolded with mechanical precision. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kates, 36 Aichi D-3 Avals, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M Zeros, prepared to deliver what their pilots believed would be a knockout blow to Midway's defenses. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga pulled his leather flying helmet tight and performed his final cockpit check. As leader of the strike force, the weight of expectation pressed upon his shoulders like a physical burden. Around him, propellers coughed to life in sequence, their roar building to a crescendo that drowned out all other sound. The deck crew, clad in their colorful jerseys, red for ordnance, blue for plane handlers, yellow for flight deck officers, scurried between the aircraft like worker ants preparing for war. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, Tominaga's Kate rolled forward, gathering speed until it lifted gracefully from the Akagi's bow. Behind him, wave after wave of aircraft followed, forming up in precise formations before turning toward their target. The sight of so many warplanes darkening the sky filled every Japanese sailor with fierce pride. Admiral Nagumo watched the launch from his command bridge, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. The strike force represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots who had honed their skills over China and perfected their techniques during 6 months of Pacific conquest. Surely nothing could withstand such concentrated fury. But 400 miles to the northeast, another drama was unfolding that would forever alter the course of the war. Aboard the American aircraft carrier Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance studied intelligence reports with growing amazement. Thanks to the brilliant code-breaking work of Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo, the Americans knew almost exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. The contrast between the two forces could hardly have been more stark. Where the Japanese relied on veteran pilots and proven tactics, the Americans fielded hastily trained aviators flying from 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter still bearing scars from the Battle of the Coral Sea. Many American pilots had fewer than 50 hours in their aircraft types, compared to Japanese aviators with thousands of hours of combat experience. At Midway itself, the morning, routine shattered when radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation at 7:05. Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding the Marine Aircraft Group 22, scrambled every available fighter, a mixed bag of obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and newer Grumman F-4F Wildcats. The Marines knew they were outclassed, but they also knew the fate of the entire Pacific might hang on how long they could delay the enemy attack. As documented in Gordon Pranga's authoritative account, Miracle at Midway, the Japanese strike force approached its target with the confidence born of unbroken victory, unaware that American intelligence had penetrated their most secret communications. The first Zeros swept over Eastern Island at 7:20, their 20mm cannons chattering death. Behind them came the Vals, peeling off in steep dives to plant their bombs with surgical precision among the fuel dumps and aircraft hangars. The Kates followed at low level, their pilots threading between anti-aircraft bursts to deliver their ordnance with devastating accuracy. Marine Captain Marion Carl fought his Wildcat through a swirling dogfight with 3 Zeros, his aircraft shuddering, under hits but still flying. All around him, American fighters fell like autumn leaves, their inexperienced pilots no match for the elite Japanese aviators. Yet, for every American plane shot down, the defenders bought precious minutes for Midway's garrison to take cover and survive. The Japanese attack lasted exactly 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes transformed Midway's landscape into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. Fuel storage tanks erupted in towering columns of black smoke, barracks buildings collapsed under direct hits, and the airfield's runways were cratered beyond immediate use. Lieutenant Tominaga circled the devastation, assessing the damage through his bomb sight. While the attack had been successful, he could see that Midway's defenses were far from eliminated. Anti-aircraft guns still fired defiant bursts skyward, and he counted at least a dozen American aircraft that had somehow survived the onslaught. The installations would require a second strike to complete their destruction. As the Japanese formation wheeled westward toward their carriers, Tominaga made the fateful radio call that would seal his fleet's doom. "There is need for a second attack wave." His words, intercepted by American radio operators, confirmed what Admiral Spruance already suspected. The Japanese were committed to the attack and had no idea that 3 American carrier task forces were racing toward them through the morning. Swells. The first act of the drama had concluded, But the real battle was yet to begin. The clock on Admiral Nagumo's command bridge read 9:18 when Lieutenant Tomonaga's message crackled through the radio. There is need for a second attack. Wave. The word struck the Japanese admiral like a physical blow, shattering his carefully laid plans and forcing him into a decision that would haunt naval historians for generations. Below decks on all four carriers, the controlled frenzy of rearming operations had already begun. Mechanics swarmed over the Kate torpedo bombers of the second wave, unloading the deadly Type 91 torpedoes and replacing them with high-explosive bombs for land attack. The process was delicate, time-consuming work that left the hangar, decks cluttered with ordnance and fuel lines, a floating arsenal waiting for a spark. Captain Taijiro Aoki approached his admiral with visible concern, etched across his features. "Sir, we have another problem. Our morning search planes have been delayed by mechanical issues. We have incomplete coverage to the northeast quadrant." Nagumo's jaw tightened. The northeast quadrant, precisely the direction from which American reinforcements would most likely approach. He had gambled that no significant American forces remained in the area, but doubt gnawed at him like a persistent toothache. At that exact moment, 400 miles away, the scene aboard the American carrier Enterprise painted a stark contrast to the Japanese confidence. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his oxygen mask and studied the vast Pacific stretching endlessly in all directions. Leading 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers in search of the enemy fleet, he had been flying for over 2 hours without contact. Fuel gauges showed critical levels, and McCluskey faced the agonizing decision that confronted every naval aviator's worst nightmare: continue searching and risk running out of fuel, or turn back and abandon the mission. His radio man, Gunner Walter Chakalusek, repeatedly checked their navigation equipment, hoping against hope for some sign of the Japanese fleet. The morning had started with such promise. Admiral Spruance had launched his attack groups before dawn, sending every available aircraft toward the Japanese fleet's estimated position. But the ocean was vast, and the margin for error razor-thin. One miscalculation, one faulty navigation reading, and the entire American strike would miss its target completely. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese carrier Soryu, Lieutenant Commander Takashige Igusa was experiencing his own frustration. A veteran of Pearl Harbor and countless other battles, Igusa commanded the ship's dive bomber squadron with the authority of proven experience. But this morning, his aircraft sat useless on the hangar deck, while mechanics worked feverishly to rearm them with land attack bombs. "How much longer?" Igusa demanded of the chief mechanic, his voice tight with barely controlled impatience. The man's grease-stained coveralls told the story of round-the-clock labor, but the rearming process could not be rushed without risking catastrophic accidents. As chronicled in Mitsuo Fuchida's first-hand account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the Japanese fleet found itself caught in a tactical nightmare, with their aircraft configured for the wrong type of attack at the worst possible moment. At 10:20, the Japanese fleet's nightmare became reality. Petty Officer First Class Amari Tone, operating a search plane from the cruiser Tone, transmitted the message that would change everything. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. The effect on the Akagi's bridge was electric. American ships yaren traveling at over 20 knots, which meant they included carriers, were precisely where Japanese intelligence had assured them no enemy forces existed. Nagumo's carefully orchestrated plan collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Order all squadrons to rearm with torpedoes immediately," Nagumo commanded, his voice betraying none of the panic that gripped his heart. "Belay the second Midway strike. We engage the American fleet." But the order came too late. In the hangar decks below, the rearming process would require at least another hour to complete. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the decks. Fuel lines snaked between aircraft, and the carriers were more vulnerable than they had been since leaving Japanese waters. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, still searching desperately for the enemy fleet, finally spotted something that made his heart race. A Japanese destroyer racing northward at flank speed, its wake cutting a white arrow across the blue Pacific. The ship was the Arashi, hurrying to rejoin the main fleet after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. Following the destroyer's wake like a hunter following tracks, McCluskey's formation climbed toward attack altitude. At 10:22, his voice crackled across the radio frequencies with words that would echo through history. Enemy carriers in sight. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers lay spread below him like toys on a blue carpet, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being hastily prepared for launch. Anti-aircraft fire began to reach toward the American dive bombers, but McCluskey had achieved what every naval aviator dreamed of: complete tactical surprise against an enemy caught with his pants down. The hunters had become the hunted, and the odd, morning sun that had risen so promisingly on Japanese ambitions now illuminated the beginning of their empire's doom. At exactly 10:26 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed over into his dive, beginning a sequence of events that would last barely 5 minutes but reshape the entire Pacific War. Behind him, 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers followed in perfect succession, their engines screaming as they plummeted toward the Japanese carriers spread like sitting ducks on the ocean's surface. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched in horrified fascination as the American aircraft grew larger in his binoculars. The timing could not have been worse. His flight decks were crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed, fuel lines stretched across the hangar decks, and bombs and torpedoes lay stacked in deadly profusion throughout his ships. The perfect killing ground for dive bombers. All hands, prepare for dive bombing attack. Captain Aoki's voice boomed across the Akagi's intercom system. Sailors scattered for cover as the carrier's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with deadly black bursts. But the American pilots had achieved complete surprise, and their shallow angle of attack made tracking difficult for the frantically traversing gun crews. Lieutenant Commander Dick Best, leading his squadron from the Enterprise, selected the Akagi as his primary target. The carrier's distinctive forward island structure and flight deck configuration made identification certain even from high altitude. As his Dauntless reached the release point, Best toggled his bomb release and felt the aircraft lurch upward as the 1,000-pound bomb fell away toward its target. The bomb struck the Akagi's flight deck just aft of the midships elevator, punching through the wooden planking and exploding in the upper hangar deck among the rearming aircraft. Secondary explosions followed in rapid succession as aviation gasoline ignited and ordnance cooked off. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown attacked the Soryu with devastating precision. Captain Ryusaku Yanagamoto watched helplessly as 3 bombs bracketed his ship in quick succession. The first struck forward of the island, the second hit amidships among the rearming torpedo bombers, and the third exploded in the after portion of the flight deck. Chati, Soryu's damage proved even more catastrophic than the Akagi's. Her entire flight deck became a sheet of flame, and repeated explosions in the hangar spaces sent pillars of fire shooting skyward like some hellish geyser. Within 20 minutes of the first bomb hit, Captain Yanagamoto gave the order to abandon ship, though he himself chose to remain aboard and go down with his command. As documented in Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, these 5 minutes of coordinated dive-bombing attacks delivered a blow to Japanese naval aviation from which it would never recover, destroying in moments what had taken years to build. The Kaga suffered a similar fate under the bombs of Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's remaining aircraft. The massive carrier, converted from a battleship hull and carrying over 90 aircraft, became a floating crematorium as her aviation gasoline storage areas erupted in successive explosions. Captain Jisaku Okada fought desperately to save his ship, but the fires proved uncontrollable. Only the Hiryu, steaming separately to the north, escaped the initial American onslaught. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, arguably the most aggressive commander in the Japanese fleet, immediately ordered his remaining aircraft prepared for a counterattack. His pilots, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, represented Japan's last hope of salvaging victory from disaster. Petty Officer Hiroshi Suzuki, who had so carefully armed the morning strike aircraft, found himself trapped in the Akagi's lower hangar deck as fires raged above his head. The Yato, Steel bulkheads grew hot to the touch, and the acrid smoke of burning aviation fuel made breathing nearly impossible. Around him, other sailors struggled to reach escape routes as the ship's structure groaned under the stress of repeated explosions. Admiral Nagumo, his face blackened by smoke and his white uniform torn, reluctantly transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara as his flagship became uninhabitable. The irony was crushing. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor now watched his own fleet burning under American bombs delivered with the same devastating precision his pilots had achieved 6 months earlier. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, wounded but still conscious, was carried to the Nagara on a stretcher, his career as Japan's premier naval aviator effectively ended by American bombs. As he was loaded aboard the cruiser, he could see the Akagi's flight deck buckled and twisted, her forward elevator blown completely out of its shaft, and standing vertically like some bizarre monument to American marksmanship. The 5 minutes that began at 10:26 had accomplished what months of American industrial production and training could not: the destruction of Japanese naval aviation's irreplaceable core of veteran pilots and experienced maintenance crews. 3 aircraft carriers that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months were now burning wrecks, their aircraft and aircrew consumed in the fires of their own ammunition. But the battle was far from over. The Hiryu still floated intact to the north, and her admiral was a man who did not know the meaning of surrender. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, his jaw set in grim determination as pillars of black smoke rose from his burning sister ships on the southern horizon. At 49 years of age, Yamaguchi was considered the most promising flag officer in the Imperial Navy, a man many believed destined to lead Japan's fleet to ultimate victory. Now, with 3/4 of his carrier force destroyed, he faced the ultimate test of his strategic brilliance. "All aircraft, prepare for immediate launch," Yamaguchi commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos of the morning's disaster. "We will strike the American carriers with everything we have." His remaining force was pitifully small compared to the morning's strength: 18 Aichi-D, 3 A-Val dive bombers, and 6 Mitsubishi A-6M0s. But these aircraft represented Japan's last hope of avoiding complete catastrophe. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, leading the strike force, saluted crisply before climbing into his Val's cockpit. A veteran of the China conflict and Pearl Harbor, Kobayashi understood the desperate nature of their mission. Behind him, his fellow pilots, men like Lieutenant Ogawa and Petty Officer Goto, prepared their aircraft with the methodical precision of samurai preparing for a final battle. At 11:05, the Hiryu's remaining aircraft launched into the brilliant Pacific morning, their engines straining as they climbed toward the American fleet. Far to the south, the funeral pyres of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu continued to burn, sending up smoke columns visible for 50 miles in every direction. Meanwhile, aboard the American carrier Yorktown, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher monitored radio transmissions with growing satisfaction. The morning's strike had exceeded even his most optimistic expectations, crippling the Japanese carrier force in a single devastating blow. But Fletcher was too experienced a commander to believe the battle was over. Somewhere out there, at least one Japanese carrier remained operational and dangerous. The Yorktown's radar operators confirmed Fletcher's suspicions at 11:58 when they detected incoming aircraft bearing 270 degrees, distance 46 miles. "General quarters! General quarters! All hands man your battle stations!" The klaxon's wail sent sailors racing to their positions as the carrier's combat air patrol of 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcats climbed to intercept. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading the Yorktown's fighter defense, spotted the incoming Japanese formation at 12:05. 18 dive bombers escorted by 6 fighters, a small force by morning standards, but still capable of delivering a crippling blow to an unprepared carrier. Thatch's Wildcats dove into the attack, their 50 caliber machine guns chattering. As they tore into the Japanese formation, Lieutenant Kobayashi pressed his attack despite the fierce American fighter opposition, his Val shuddering under hits, but still flyable. Below him, the Yorktown appeared to grow larger by the second, her flight deck crowded with aircraft and personnel. At exactly 12:12, he released his bomb from 1,500 feet and pulled out of his dive, his rear gunner firing desperately at pursuing American fighters. As detailed in Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, The Japanese attack on the Yorktown demonstrated the skill and determination of veteran aviators who refused to accept defeat even in the face of overwhelming odds. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in quick succession. The first hit near the island structure, starting fires in the signal bridge area. The second penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar space, igniting aviation gasoline and creating a raging inferno. The third bomb struck aft, damaging the steering gear and reducing the carrier's speed to 15 knots. Captain Elliot Buckmaster fought desperately to save his ship, his damage control parties working with practiced efficiency to contain the fires and restore power. The Yorktown had survived worse at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and her crew was determined not to lose her now. Within 2 hours, the fires were under control and the carrier was making 20 knots. Her flight deck, operational despite visible damage, but Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. At 2:30 in the afternoon, he launched his final strike. 10 Nakajima B-5N, Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, wounded in the morning attack on Midway but still flyable, led this desperate mission, knowing it would likely be his last. The American Combat Air Patrol had been reinforced, and the torpedo bombers faced a gauntlet of fighter attacks as they approached the Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley's fighting squadron, 42, ripped into the Japanese formation, shooting down 4 Kates before they could reach attack position. But 6 torpedo bombers pressed through the defensive screen, their pilots displaying the suicidal courage that would become the hallmark of Japan's final war years. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown on her port side, flooding her forward engine room and causing a severe list to port. This time, Captain Buckmaster could not save his ship. At 3:05, he gave the order to abandon ship, and the crew of the gallant carrier slid down ropes into the Pacific swells. Lieutenant Tominaga never returned from the mission. His Kate, damaged and leaking fuel, disappeared into the vast Pacific, adding another name to the growing list of Japan's fallen heroes. The Dragon had drawn its last breath, but the cost in blood and aircraft left the Hiryu fatally weakened for what was to come. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith, both fleets licked their wounds and prepared for the final act of the drama that had already decided the fate of the Pacific War. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as Enterprise dive bombers climbed toward attack altitude, their pilots grimly determined to complete the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation. Below them, the Hiryu steamed in desperate circles, her anti-aircraft guns already elevated toward the approaching American aircraft. Admiral Yamaguchi had expended his offensive punch against the Yorktown. Now his flagship would face the same fate that had befallen her sister ships. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, leading Enterprise Air Group 6, selected his aim point on the Hiryu's flight deck with the cold precision of an experienced combat aviator. The Japanese carrier appeared surprisingly small from 15,000 feet, but Gallagher knew that size was deceptive. One well-placed bomb could transform the most powerful warship into a floating coffin. At exactly 5:03 in the afternoon, Gallagher pushed over into his attack dive, followed by 13 other Douglas SBD Dauntless bombers from the Enterprise. The Hiryu's anti-aircraft fire reached toward them like deadly fingers, but the American pilots had learned their trade well during the morning's successful attacks on the other Japanese carriers. Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on his bridge wing, watching the American dive bombers grow larger with each passing second. Around him, his crew fought their ship with the desperate courage of men who knew they faced annihilation. The Hiryu's guns fired continuously, filling the sky with black bursts of shrapnel, but the Americans maintained their formation with professional discipline. The first bomb struck the Hiryu's flight deck forward of the island, penetrating to the hangar deck before exploding among the remaining aircraft. Secondary explosions followed as aviation gasoline ignited and ammunition cooked off. Within minutes, the last operational Japanese carrier was transformed into a blazing wreck. Her flight deck buckled and twisted beyond recognition. Admiral Yamaguchi made no attempt to transfer his flag to another ship. Instead, he stood calmly on the Hiryu's bridge as fires raged throughout his command, composing a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. Our planes did their best, but were unable to obtain good results. I am staying aboard ship to share the fate of my men. Below decks, The same scenes of heroism and tragedy that had played out aboard the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were repeated once more. Damage control parties fought fires that could not be controlled. Engine room crews maintained power until the rising water drove them topside. And medical personnel tended to wounded shipmates despite the obvious futility of their situation, as documented in the personal memoirs of Admiral Clarence Wade McCluskey. The Battle of Midway represented not just a tactical victory, but the moment when American naval aviation came of age and proved it could match the finest pilots in the world. Petty Officer Abe, one of the Hiryu's senior aviation mechanics, found himself trapped in the lower hangar deck as fires spread throughout the ship's interior. The steel bulkheads glowed red-hot, and the smoke had become so thick that breathing was nearly impossible. Around him, other sailors struggled toward escape routes that might no longer exist. As darkness fell over the Pacific, the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that had begun the day as the most powerful naval force in the world lay burning or sunk beneath the waves. With them died not only irreplaceable ships, but the cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots, aircrew, and maintenance personnel whose skills could not be quickly replaced. The human cost was staggering. Captain Yanagimoto went down with the Soryu, standing at attention on his bridge as the waters closed over his ship. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku chose the same fate aboard the Hiryu. Their bodies never recovered from the depths of the Pacific. Hundreds of experienced pilots and aircrew, men like Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, who survived but was permanently invalided, represented losses that Japan's aviation industry could not absorb. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato, received the final radio transmission from the burning Hiryu at 6:30 in the evening. Fires out of control. Ship listing heavily to starboard. Request permission to scuttle. Permission was granted, and at 2:30 in the morning of June 5th, the last of the Pearl Harbor attack force slipped beneath the Pacific swells. The Battle of Midway had lasted barely 2 days, but its consequences would resonate for the remainder of the war. Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, over 300 aircraft, and most critically, the veteran pilots and aircrew who had made their early victories possible. The Imperial Navy would never again mount a major offensive operation in the Pacific. As the sun rose on June 5, 1942, the wreckage of Japanese ambitions lay scattered across the ocean floor near a small coral atoll that most Americans had never heard of before the battle began. The rising sun that had seemed so invincible after Pearl Harbor had begun its long descent toward final eclipse, and the tide of war in the Pacific had turned irreversibly toward the United States. In the words of Admiral Yamamoto himself, spoken after receiving the final casualty reports, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The giant was now fully awake, and Japanese forces had indeed sunk with their pride into Midway's abyss.